Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In the final part of his article, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, Alan Turing is going to discuss what he calls learning machines. And so this is probably the section that people who are interested in questions of AI will focus on the most. Before that, he set out the imitation game, the original imitation game, not what it's been reduced to by a lot of people as the so-called Turing Test, and then looked at a lot of objections. Now, one of the objections that got brought up was from Lady Lovelace, and she was somebody, early on associated with Charles Babbage and the idea of mechanical computers. And she asserted that, listen, a machine just can't do anything that it hasn't been programmed to do. You've got to give it input. It doesn't have any, let's call it, agency or autonomy of its own. And so he says that, let's think about that for a moment. So we can say that a person could inject an idea into a machine, it will respond to a certain extent, then drop into quiescence like a piano string struck by a hammer. Okay, that's one model. What if we thought of an atomic pile instead? So an atomic pile is a certain amount of atomic material, radioactive material, and you launch a neutron into the pile. Each neutron causes a disturbance, which eventually dies away. But if you have a big enough pile, you reach what we call critical mass, well, then the neutrons can kind of cascade and produce a big effect, which will actually destroy the entire pile, right? So he asks, is there a corresponding phenomenon for mind, and is there one for machines? And so we've got this idea of subcritical, like, whatever you're doing, okay, it has some effect, but the effect dies away. And then you could have critical. And could you even talk about supercritical, right? So he says that ideas presented to most minds on average give rise to less than one idea in reply. Okay, so that's a little vague there, but go with it. A smallish proportion are supercritical, an idea presented to such a mind that would give rise to an entire theory consisting of secondary, tertiary, more remote ideas. That would be supercritical. And he says animal minds, they seem to be definitely subcritical. Maybe he's generalizing too much there. And so we can ask, well, what about a machine? Now, he doesn't say machine minds. He just says, could a machine be made to be supercritical? That's a key question here. And it would depend on, size to some degree and complexity. Then he brings up a skin of an onion analogy. And he says, in considering functions of the mind or the brain, we find some operations we can explain in purely mechanical terms. So we don't say that those correspond to the real mind. It's like a skin that we have to strip off if we're to find the real mind. And then what remains, we find a further skin to strip off. And here's the problem. Do we ever get to the real mind, the core, that is the intelligence? Or is it just onion, stripping away over and over again, and we're eventually left with just skin that has nothing in it? So he's going to say These don't claim to be convincing arguments. These are recitations tending to produce belief. So what else could we do? What else could we provide? He says that, one thing we could do is wait for the end of the century and see where things stand at that point. But if we want to carry out a successful experiment to try to see if we could actually produce something like artificial intelligence, maybe we need to do some stuff right now on the way. So he's writing this, deep in the last century. And he says, to me, this seems to be largely a matter of programming. Also advances in engineering, but it's unlikely those won't be adequate for the requirements. And we could think about our own time, definitely advances in engineering of computer chips and all sorts of other things. And we've had advances in programming too. And he's going to talk about the level of complexity that would be required. But it all comes down to one thing. How can we program machines to play the game? What is the game? The imitation game. Being able to satisfactorily, not in every case, but in some, determinate level that we decide on, fool a human being into thinking that the computer on the other end of the communication is actually a human being and not just a digital computer. How can we get machines to be able to play the game adequately? So he says, let's think about how adult minds come to be what they are. What is the process that has brought it to the state it's in? And he says, there's three components we can distinguish. There's an initial state of the mind at birth, right? So you could say what we're hardwired with, right? The education to which it's been subjected, and then other experience not to be described as education to which it's been subjected. And he says, this, if we think about it this way, this raises a way of approaching the problem in a different way. Why are we trying to simulate an adult mind? That's actually what a lot of artificial intelligence has tried to do, even down to the present day, right? How can we make it look like an adult human being? But why not simulate a child mind at the start and then teach it, then educate it, train it, as they like to say today? So if it were subjected to an appropriate course of education, well, then you would get the adult brain, wouldn't you? So he says we've divided our problem into two parts. You've got the child program and then the education process, and these are connected to each other. So, and it's going to take a lot of trial and error. We cannot expect to find a good child machine at the first attempt. We have to experiment with teaching one such machine, see how well it learns, then try another, see if it's better or worse. And he says, we could draw a parallel here between the process of evolution and the actions of human intelligence. So, the structure of the child machine is hereditary material. Changes of the child machine is mutation, natural selection, judgment of the experimenter. But there's an advantage here. Human intelligence, the programmer, the researcher, is quicker and more judicious than evolution. Evolution is kind of messy and takes a long time. You got to reproduce, all of that. So we can also weed out random mutations to some degree. So he says you can't do the same thing with the machine as you can with a normal child. Obviously, there's limitations, right? No legs, so you can't have the child go out and fill the coal scuttle. I mean, who has their child fill the coal scuttle today? Unless you actually use coal in your stove to heat your place, you probably don't know what a coal scuttle is, right? Or unless you maybe read literature. There's all sorts of other things associated with embodiment, we could say, that would be an issue. But with intellectual matters, we could teach a child computer mind, couldn't we? How would we do this? He says, well, we normally associate rewards and punishments with the teaching process, and we could program some child machines to have something like that. So, we could have a reward signal which increased the probability of repetition of the events that led up to it. We could have a punishment signal as well. Exactly what is reward and punishment going to look like, he doesn't specify. But he does point out a problem here. He says, listen, rewards and punishments, that's part of the teaching process, but it better not be the entirety of it. As a matter of fact, there would need to be an awful lot more than just rewards and punishments. But, with these other unemotional channels of communication, then we can teach a machine by rewards and punishments to obey orders given in some symbolic language, right? And this would diminish the number of rewards and punishments needed. So this is what, the teaching process looks like. And he says, opinions would vary as to the complexity which is suitable in the child machine. So we could have, at one extreme, let's make the child machine as simple as possible. Let's have everything else be a matter of education and learning along the way. Okay, that's one option. On the other side, we could have a very well-developed child machine, so a starting point, right? He says that we could have a complete system of logical inference built in with definitions, propositions that are arranged in some sort of hierarchy. Some of them would be described as imperatives, and then maybe you need less teaching along the way. And he talks about, these imperatives being parts of systems, not part of the rules of the system, but being built into it. And those could be programs, subroutines, whatever you like, right? So, where would it get this education? It could be in a largely deductive way, you train it along the way. You could also be doing it by the machine engaging with things, the world, other people, through what he calls scientific induction. So, there's different ways of carrying out this education. Okay, so far, so good. He says, some people are going to find this idea of a learning machine rather paradoxical. Why? Well, how can the rules of operation of the machine change? If it's actually learning and adapting, isn't it changing its own programming to some degree? And Turing's answer is, well, yes, of course. However, we can distinguish between sort of like the top level stuff, which is not changing. You could also call it bottom level if you like the metaphor of foundation. And then what he's going to call rules getting changed in the learning process being of a rather less pretentious kind, claiming only an ephemeral validity. So they're less general, right? They don't apply to everything. Maybe the machine, in its basic programming, learns how it ought to deal with customers in an American setting so that it can be a good customer service bot, but its programming doesn't work quite well for British customers or Indian customers or pick whoever else, and it has to be, the rules have to be tweaked. It has to learn these things along the way to become a better British customer service bot or Indian customer service bot. It's not changing the overall rules. He notes another very interesting feature that does apply to a lot of our experimentation with so-called artificial intelligence. An important feature of a learning machine is that its teacher will often be largely ignorant of what is going on inside, though they may still be able to predict the pupil's behavior. And he says this should apply most strongly to the later education of a machine arising from a child machine of a well-tried design or program. So, as opposed to systems where we know exactly what to expect from it, we're not quite sure what's going on inside. in the process of education. I mean, to be fair, that's the case with human students as well, right? We can't open up their heads and peer inside. And any educator who tells you they know exactly what's going on with their students is, deluded or lying to you, or, I don't know, trying to sell you something. The other thing that he brings up is we need to think about what intelligent behavior actually looks like. So he says, intelligent behavior presumably consists in a departure from completely disciplined behavior involved in computation. So it's not just following programming or order or rules. Notice the proviso, though, but a rather slight one. So it deviates from its programming by introducing new things, but just slightly, not giving rise to random behavior, stuff that doesn't make any sense at all, or getting stuck in pointless, repetitive loops. That's not really intelligent behavior. And so, this would be leading to something that could pass the imitation game test. He also mentions it's probably wise to include some random element in a learning machine. Why? Because it's better than trying to provide rules for everything. Especially if you're dealing with real life stuff, you need to just try something out. And random responses could do that. And he's going to finish here by saying, we may hope that machines will eventually compete with human beings in all purely intellectual fields. Notice what he's not saying. He's not saying the word replace, that intelligent machines would replace human beings in all intellectual fields. And notice, too, that it's confined to purely intellectual fields. So he's making his projection, his hope, one that is rather, let's say, qualified, right? Now, he also raises another problem. Which purely intellectual field would be the best one to start with? And he says, this is a difficult decision. Some people think that a very abstract activity like the playing of chess would be best. It could also be maintained it's best to provide it with the best sense organs money can buy and then teach it to understand and speak English, right? And he says, I don't know what the right answer is, but I think both approaches should be tried, because if you're not actually experimenting with this stuff, all of this theorizing is very nice, but it remains rather speculative. And this is where the article ends without any super strongly established conclusions about exactly what is going to happen or exactly what anything like artificial intelligence would be.